which is to break apart, presumably referring to the psychological effect of cannabis which causes the user to disassociate from themselves. It seems very likely, therefore, that the sacred soma and hauma derived from a common source which contained cannabis. Therefore, we should reasonably deduce that domesticated cannabis cultivated for drug use was spread into Iran and India by the ancient Aryans of the Andronovo culture at the end of the Bronze Age, and continued to be spread around Eurasia by their Iron Age descendants, the Scythians. Even in modern India, ganja is either smoked or consumed in a milkshake called bhang lassi by devotees of the god Shiva, a god who they believe enjoys smoking cannabis himself. They share the cannabis with the destroyer god as prasad, that is, the shared sacrificial offering. In the shamanic Chinese poem of the Chu state called The Nine Songs, written about 300 BC, a goddess called Shao Simin offers a god called Da Simin, the Lord of Life, a twig from a plant called Shuma or Suma, at the eternal farewell. The first commentary on the Nine Songs was written 400 years later by Wang Yi, and he annotates the term Shuma as mythical hemp. This hemp was associated with an offering given to the Lord of Life, yet Shuma itself refers to the deity as well as to the plant offered to that deity. The exact same holds true for Soma in India and Hauma of Iran, for each refers respectively to a plant, a ritual drink made from that plant, and a god associated with that drink. Some have argued that Chinese Shuma was a word borrowed from Aryans of the Tarim Basin in western China, who made a drink from ephedra and cannabis from which both Hauma and Soma are derived. But there is a problem with that theory. Shuma is a compound word comprised of shu, meaning sparse or distant, and ma, which means hemp. Thus together they mean distant hemp, which is rendered as mystical hemp in accepted translations. Cannabis, as already demonstrated by genetic evidence, is native to China and was first domesticated there, and ma is used in inscriptions over 3,000 years old, so there is no need to propose that shuma is a loanword from Proto-Indo-Iranic at all. Ma is used to refer to other plants too. For example, ephedra was called ma huan, meaning yellow hemp, and during the Han dynasty, the Chinese called sesame seeds and their oil hu ma, meaning hemp of the foreigners, while calling their own hemp Han ma, meaning hemp of the Han race, and they also called their own hemp Huo ma, which means fire hemp, and that implies that they burned it, perhaps for ritual drug use. Huo ma sounds a lot like Hauma, and back in 1982, Manda Hassan proposed that the Iranic word Hauma derives from the Chinese Huoma or Huma, which he argued was transported by Aryan aesthetics into the Bactria Margiana region of Afghanistan as Hauma, while among the Aryans who took it to India, it became Soma in Sanskrit, since it is known that H mutates into S in the early Indic language. Manda Hassan devised this theory long before the genetic evidence of Iranic people in western China was proven, or archaeological evidence of cannabis smokers in Jirizangpal cemetery was discovered, and cannabis was identified in the Jushi shaman graves. This was also before genetics had confirmed the relationship between the Aryan invaders of India and Iran with the Iron Age mummies of Tarim and the Scythians. He relied only on linguistics, but his theory has been strengthened by all these recent genetic and archaeological discoveries. Besides the Indo-Iranic speakers, many other peoples in the ancient world used cannabis, specifically Semitic peoples of the Middle East. We can trace the spread of the plant through linguistics. The Indic word bhanga and the Iranic bang or mam were not the only Indo-Iranic words for cannabis. As already mentioned, the Greek cannabis, cognate of English cannabis, comes from an Iranic word related to the Persian word kanaf or kanab, which it seems the Persians, like the Greeks, took from the Scythians of the steppe. This East Iranic Scythian word is sometimes reconstructed as konaba. Kanab or konaba is also thought to be the source of kanubu, a word used in the cuneiform library of the Assyrian king Assurbanipal in the 5th century BC to describe a kind of incense. In a letter dated to 680 BC, sent to Assurbanipal's grandmother from a high priest who answers her question about which ingredients are used in the sacred rites, he replies, "The main items for the rites are fine oil, water, honey, odorous plants, and kanubu." The Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian words kanubu and kanabu are thought to mean a way to produce smoke and are speculated to refer to cannabis. Similar speculation has long surrounded the biblical Hebrew term kanir boshem, literally aromatic reed, which linguists variously identify as cannabis, lemongrass, or sweet cane. The Jewish God tells Moses to make a holy oil from myrrh, cinnamon, kanir boshim, and cassia. Professor of Classical Studies at Boston University, Carl Ruck, claimed in 2009 that the Hebrew kanir boshem is the same Scythian word that Herodotus wrote as cannabis, and that large amounts of it were compounded into the ointment for the ordination of the Hebrew priest, who would inhale the incense inside the temple.
The word cannabis is a Greek assimilation of the Scythian word, and other cultures have assimilated as well. The Hebrew version of it is cannabis. Cannabis was the ingredient in the incense that the high priest entered the enclosed tent, like the Scythian fumigation tent, of the inner tabernacle. And in that enclosed space, he saw Yahweh materialize, doing the covenant with the deity, the highest sacrament of the religion. And it was induced by a vision, accessed by cannabis.
His claims could perhaps be dismissed as wild speculation, were it not for recent archaeological evidence from Israel. In 2020, at Tel Arad, near Jerusalem, archaeologists took samples from the altars of an 8th century Jewish shrine, first discovered in 1962. The organic residue from the 2 limestone altars was tested and determined to contain burnt cannabis and frankincense. This is the first time that cannabis has been scientifically identified in the ancient Near East. But many believe it was used by Hebrews and other Semitic peoples much earlier, and they point to the words kunabu and konaboshem as evidence. If they are right, then it seems likely the plant was introduced to Semitic peoples by the Persians or the Scythians in the Iron Age. However, there is also evidence that cannabis was spread not only by Iranic Aryan peoples in the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, but also by their Proto-Indo-European ancestors of the Eastern European steppe thousands of years earlier. Back in 2017, a study by Teng Wen Long and colleagues from the Free University of Berlin argued that cannabis was domesticated in the West by steppe peoples at the same time it was domesticated in China. They argued, using archaeological evidence, that the Proto-Indo-European steppe peoples such as the Yamnaya, spread the cannabis plant. This facial reconstruction by Robert Molyneux shows you what the Yamnaya people looked like. However, the genetic study from this year proves all domesticated cannabis comes from a single East Asian domestication event, thus disproving the multi-regional theory, despite it relying on a database of cannabis in the archaeological record, which shows cannabis was widely distributed from as early as 10,000 years ago, or even earlier. The conflicting archaeological and genetic evidence has not been conclusively resolved yet. The Yamnaya culture began over 5,000 years ago and spread as far west as Hungary. One Yamnaya grave at Gurbenesti in Romania contained a clay vessel with what is thought to be carbonized hemp seeds. If so, likely the earliest evidence for the burning of cannabis. The British archaeologist Andrew Sharratt argued in 1995 that the Yamnaya invaders first introduced cannabis smoking to the Danube Valley. He also claimed that the even older steppe culture of Sredny Stog in Ukraine, which is probably the original Proto-Indo-European culture and dates back over 6,000 years, used cannabis as a socially approved intoxicant, celebrating its significance by imprinting it on their pottery. He was referring to corded impressions on the clay vessels of the Sredny Stog culture, which he argued represented hemp cords. He also pointed to the presence of burning braziers in Bronze Age European cultures, which are sometimes described as incense cups, as a continuation of a steppe tradition of burning cannabis in braziers. An argument he made long before the discovery of the 2,500-year-old Iranic cannabis braziers from Xinjiang in China. This brazier, or Braunos, was made by people of Hungary's Copper Age Bodrog-Keresztür culture, which is considered to be Indo-Europeanized by neighboring steppe cultures. This one is from the nearby Karnavoda culture, whose pottery was influenced by the corded ware of the Sredny Stog culture on the steppe. While this brazier was found in a Yamnaya barrow near Mikhailovka in the Volga region of South Russia, as were these ones. The Belbika people were related to Sredny Stog and Yamnaya people, and Belbika finds from near Stonehenge include numerous so-called incense burners, such as the Stonehenge incense cup you see here. Was this cup used by an early British shaman to burn cannabis? Sharratt wrote, "The realization is gradually dawning on archaeologists that such practices, widespread in the ethnographic record, are inherently likely to have existed in prehistoric times. It seems entirely probable that in their practices and associated mythology, the societies of Aboriginal Europe were smoking cultures." Conclusive evidence that Belbika people used cannabis was found near the global capital of cannabis itself, Amsterdam. In 2012, analysis of the pollen from plants strewn within a Belbika tomb at Hattemerbroek in the Netherlands, dated between 2459 and 2200 BC, contemporary with the Stonehenge incense cup, revealed that they were almost certainly cannabis. Once again, we see a connection between cannabis and an Indo-European funeral ritual, but long before the Iranic people emerged. Although conclusive study of the THC content of cannabis from these early Indo-European finds has not been possible, as it was for the braziers of the Dzierżonka cemetery, we should not conclude that cannabis was never used as a drug prior to 500 BC, or that its earliest use was limited to East Asia. The archaeological record clearly demonstrates that the tradition of cannabis use has roots in the earliest Indo-European cultures. As the authors of the exhaustive Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture have noted, there are at least 3 chronological horizons to which the spread of hemp might be ascribed. the early distribution of hemp across Europe during the Neolithic, around 5000 BC or earlier, a later spread of hemp for presumably narcotic purposes around 3000 BC, and a still later spread, or at least re-emergence of hemp, in the context of textiles during the first millennium BC. We see the ancient Indo-European association of cannabis with funerary rituals was continued into more recent times with pagan cultures of the Celts and Vikings. Early Celtic use of cannabis has also been identified through pollen analysis of a bowl from a rich woman's grave of the late Hallstatt period at Niedererbach in Bavaria. Cannabis use dating to 500 BC was also identified at another Hallstatt site at Fürstengrab of Hochdorf near Stuttgart. The famous 9th century Viking boat burial at Oseberg in Norway, an Indo-European style barrow in which a grand Viking ship was interred, now kept in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. In the boat were the bodies of 2 women, the younger of whom was of a high social status, wearing expensive clothes, indicating that she had probably been a queen. She also had a purse which contained cannabis seeds. It has been proven that hemp was grown for textiles in that region of Norway for at least 200 years by the time she was buried, and hemp cordage was widely used by the Vikings. But this burial contained no hemp fabrics or cords at all. Therefore, in light of the aforementioned Indo-European cannabis funeral rituals, we can reasonably assume that these Viking seeds were related to a ritual use of cannabis as a drug rather than a fabric.